The founders of this country, when they wrote the amendments to the Constitution, stressed the importance of due process, saying that nobody could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But we've lost how important due process is. Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
As a nation, we have a pattern, and I think it's been escalating, of rejecting due process. You look at even tonight, while we're recording this podcast, there's a January 6th committee hearing, and they say that they don't have to have people cross-examined. They don't have to allow rebuttal witnesses. They can have the whole group of people be very biased and have openly expressed their bias, but yet their conclusion should be considered valid. That's like an utter rejection of due process. And that certainly isn't the only case. You look at what happened with Justice Kavanaugh when he was nominated for the Supreme Court, where they go through all the hearings for him and then they bring in one witness that they knew before, but they bring her in at the last minute and say that he was a rapist when he was in high school, and they do all these things. And again, there's no second, third witness, no process by which he can clear his name. Another example would be Kyle Rittenhouse, who the media immediately just portrayed him as murdering these people, even though you look at the footage and it's pretty clear that he had a good self-defense argument. In all these cases, America is more than happy to just look at one side and not consider the other side. And so, what happened? How did we get here? Why is due process important?
So when you think about due process is about justice. And when you look at the classic idealization of justice is a statue of a woman. In one hand, she's holding a sword. In the other hand, she's holding scales, and she's blindfolded. And the idea that justice is blind is pretty much fundamental to the nature of justice. The idea is that it's presenting as justice will weigh you, and it will sentence you. And it does not matter who you are. It does not matter what you look like. The justice doesn't care about anything other than the matters of the law. The scale weighs the law, the scale weighs the actions, but the scale doesn't weigh. Are you black? Are you white? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you friendly? Are you gregarious? Are you a cantankerous person? Justice is not supposed to care. And that is a fundamental principle of justice. And then on the other hand, you have people. And justice is carried out by people. And people are horrible. People are sinners. People have all these problems. People, are by nature fallen. And so how do you administer justice? How do you actually achieve this goal of blind justice that processes someone, whether it's President Trump and you hate him and you think he's a horrible person and you have to get him out of the way, whether you think that it's Kyle Rittenhouse and he's a horrible person because of privilege, whatever it is, that he should be treated exactly the same as anyone, as your mother, as your father, as your friend, as your enemy. And due process is the constraint on that. Due process is the means by which by the process, because you have to give authority to people. Someone has to have the ability to look at someone and go, you're going to be put to death. And if you have to give that power to a person, how do you structure things so they don't abuse it? And that is the purpose of due process. It is, without due process, any individual who has power can use it to satisfy their desires as opposed to cause justice to be done.
I think it's even more important than, you said satisfy their desires. I think when you look at it, what you have to recognize is if you don't think due process is important, and say you're a Democrat who is absolutely certain that Trump is trying to overthrow the country and trying to become a totalitarian dictator, if that's what you believe, then it would be wrong in everything that you stand for not to cheat in the election. Because if he's the next Hitler and you let Hitler get into power when all you had to do was buy a few votes, wouldn't that be terrible? You let Hitler come to power.
Right.
And, when they use this language and things, this is giving an excuse to say we can just ignore any process and instead just say the results are all that matters.
Right.
Because I think, if we're asking what is due process, I think the biblical term is justice. And then due process is going to be a subset of it. Because there's a question is, justice is very broad. So are your laws just? Do they criminalize the things that God says should be criminalized and punish them the way God says they should be punished. So that's one section, but that's not the due process. The due process is when you actually, someone needs to be punished for something or is being accused of something. Do you follow the process to make sure that, they're being treated fairly, that this, there's witnesses to it, that all these different things. I think we're going to go through in a few minutes here some of the scriptural elements of what is due process, but it has to do with not are your laws punishing the things that you should be punishing, but then let's not have. But it's the process, so making sure that we're not going to make the ends justify the means, and we think this person's bad, or we know this person's bad, so we're going to get him by any means necessary.
If you reject the sovereignty of God, people will always reject due process, because what they will always shift to is not that there is a God who rules in heaven, and he will dispose as he sees fit. What it is it's based on us, and how can I let a Hitler get into power? So when we think about these things, we have to recognize how tied they are to the theology of the church. If the church says, it's all your will, it's all your strength, this is how you're saved, then you get into power and you get into a position where you have political power. What you're going to do is say, well, we have to reject due process because it's by my strength that this country will be saved.
Right.
The example I used before was, of course you cheat in elections if you believe that.
Right.
If you believe that Donald Trump was the reincarnation of Hitler, you're going to cheat in elections unless you say God is sovereign. And so one of the reasons that we see a decay in due process is we've rejected the nature of God.
And just for what it's worth, if you're looking for some examples, recent examples of, from the other political side of people who reject due process, well, some more ways to reject due process is to say that the election is fake before it's even taken place, to say that, well, because our gut tells us that the election's fake, that we should just throw it out and not, having investigations. Those are kind of secondary. We know it's fake. Let's deal with that. I mean, so there's plenty of due process blame to go around.
And everybody's doing the same thing because everybody's saying we need to get a certain end because the end is what's important. And means don't matter. And due process, the heart of due process is means really matter.
Right.
And that's the nature of God, right? And that's what God expects of us. It says in Micah 6:8, he has shown you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you. And he doesn't say to get the results you want, to get the results I want. No, he says, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Due process is inherent to doing justly. You can't separate it. You can't do justly unless you have due process. Because in the end, due process is what protects you against bias and judgment. And all of us have bias and judgment. And so if you just say, like you said, the right, the left, it doesn't matter. Christians, non-Christians, everybody has bias and judgment. And so there has to be processes in place to protect us against our own biases because we all see the world in certain ways.
I have a cousin who's a district attorney in another state, and he was just telling me a story about a murder that his office is looking into. And he said, hey, we're really sure we know what happened, but getting the proof to prosecute the case, man, that's really hard. And what he's deferring to there is, hey, there's due process. Because when you think about, when you lean into the sovereignty of God and you think about what that really means, you're saying that God is just. God declares certain things to be right, certain things to be wrong. God declares that certain things are supposed to be within human responsibility to act upon. You're supposed to prosecute the crime of murder, and you're supposed to enact penalties for that crime. But God also says that there's a way to do it, and that way involves witnesses. And if you really believe that God is sovereign, then you can go to bed at night with a clear conscience and say, I'm pretty sure this person did it, and I don't have the witnesses to take this thing to court. But I trust God that God did not reveal that. God, who's the one who gives knowledge and wisdom, did not give us enough to move forward here. That's due process.
God who did not kill me today when
Right.
I deserved death. You know what I mean? And that's a part that
to show
people
mercy to this murderer as he shows mercy to me.
Right. And that's a part that people really forget, is that God in heaven, who knows everything about you, you deserve death, and he gives you mercy, and he gives you another day. And that is tied into his justice and his providence and his sovereignty over all things.
So in a real sense, in order to to get the society back to understanding what due process is, you really do have it. You need to rebuild the theological underpinnings of it. The theological underpinnings are God gives us means, not ends. We're supposed to, the end is we've been given the responsibility to put murderers to death. But if you don't have 2 or 3 witnesses, God didn't say this person should be put to death. And so we have to accept that God has given us the means. And so when you think of that, then due process becomes really important because it's the means, right? You have the laws and then you have the means to execute those laws. And God is very clearly, we're not the final disposers. He is.
We just read Micah 6:8, and one of the things that's in there is to do justly, to love mercy. And I just want to call it out because I want to call it every time you get a chance. It's important to understand people put justice and mercy at odds with each other, and they're not at odds with one another. Mercy is tied up in the law. Mercy is a part of the law, and mercy is part of the means that God has established by going through and doing things the way God has designed. Mercy happens, and mercy happens over and over and over in so many different ways. And so, it's really important to everybody wants to, with the other image of justice, is that justice kills everyone. And the truth is no, that's not true. Justice doesn't end up just killing everyone. Justice and due process causes mercy to be accomplishable. Otherwise, you just get the whims of man.
And right, it's to do justly and to love mercy. You're not supposed to do mercy, so it can't be at odds because they're orthogonal to one another.
And there are also limits too on what fair is, because every single person, pretty much, on death row will say the system was not fair to me.
Right.
Things were not done right, and one thing to recognize is that there are mistakes that are made that you go back and have to clean up, and there are things that can be perceived as unfair. But Scripture also gives limits where it's not that you can make any accusation and say, well, we need to overturn it because it's unfair. There are principles that you need to be appealing to, and it does come down to judgment calls, but it's not just an open season that anything you say is unfair, therefore is unfair.
And one of the most basic things is that you have rules laid out ahead of time as best you can so that everybody has the common expectation. And so that, again, we were talking before how important due process is to eliminate bias. That's how you eliminate bias. Or do the best you can, because you can't eliminate it entirely.
And as we talk about this, one of the things is you think about this primarily as a courtroom situation. We like to think of this as government, someone being tried, but in the end, due process actually affects every single aspect of life. Because in the end, there are all these things. It affects church life. It affects the way we allow. It affects business. It affects the family, and even just into the way that a father administers justice in his home. There are really elements of due process that he should follow, so that he doesn't allow his children. If you don't have a means of thinking about these things, your children will manipulate you into doing justice the way they want it to be done. And it's really easy for children to manipulate their parents if you're not on guard against it. And so there are these principles that they affect every aspect of society. And they've been built into our society over years, and they're being eroded because we've forgotten the importance of it. We don't realize there are things there that are designed to protect. And we're like, why are we doing this? This is stupid. And we just rip these things out of the way, and we're opening doors for people who are evil and who have evil intentions to get what they want and to actually harm people.
And there's so much of society that's just ordered that way that we should, like when people get in line at a counter to order food, they just go, it's not right to push in front. That's an aspect of due process. I know somebody that I've rebuked for because if they needed a tool, they'd just go buy it at Lowe's and then they'd use it the one time and then return it. Well, that's contrary to how the society is set up. And when we accept those little things, understand we will lose due process in the law. These things are connected together. If you don't think that there should be patterns that you follow, that there are communal standards that are acceptable in life, then in the end, you're going to lose it in your justice system.
Right.
And I think, our justice system tends to be better than our political system in terms of due process. The due process in our political system tends to be really bad now. That there is a lot of people who just think there should be no like the January 6th committee, you shouldn't have to answer. You shouldn't have to be able to give the other side. You can just give one side. It's Fox News versus CNN. Both say you just give one side. And that's just, the American people need to stop accepting that as a valid thing. And that will only happen when the church does.
You've hinted at it, but are you saying that due process is a part of church life too?
Absolutely.
I mean,
and I've seen
in what kinds of ways?
I mean, let's talk about justice in the church. I know of a church where a deacon was having extramarital relations with the church secretary, and they excommunicated the church secretary, and they didn't excommunicate the deacon. Well, that's like an egregious example, but these things happen frequently in churches. Like every mega church that comes out that there's a scandal because they find out the pastor's been doing it. Usually there were people in the church that knew for a long time before the scandal breaks. But a standard that they would have held other people in the church to, they don't hold the pastor to, because of course he's the pastor. We even did the Billy Graham episode, that we did recently. And in that Billy Graham episode, we're playing Billy Graham's words, and people are going, well, those are his words, but I heard the true gospel from him. He was faithful. And it's like, these are his words. We're not like making it up. And yet in the church, people just go, well, he's a heretic only 20% of the time. Well, that's called a heretic. There's a lot of people who are heretics that, you look at Arminius, and he held to 4 out of 5 points of Calvinism. He didn't hold to the perseverance of the saints, or at least that's what he professed to hold to. And so it doesn't make him less of a heretic because he's right about certain things. But when you reject due process and say you don't need to judge everything that he's saying, you don't need to judge all the false things that he's saying, you just pick and choose, well, that's a rejection of due process.
Let's talk about, one of the most common things that happens in churches. I don't know if it's the most common, but growing up in the church, this was really, really common. Scripture lays out ways that people are to deal with differences that they have when someone's wronged them, when someone's, Matthew 18 gets brought up. Everybody knows the process. You go to the person, you go to someone else, it gets brought before the church. So what happens is people don't want to go to their brother and talk to them. So instead they go to their pastor and they talk to their pastor. They try to force the pastor to deal with the problem. And the pastor goes, well, you should really go talk to the person. And the pastor knows the issue hasn't been resolved. And the pastor doesn't require them to do what they should do. And then the pastor decides, and this isn't just one case, there's usually the pastor knows about, this is all over the church. Sometimes a bunch of people have a problem with this individual. Sometimes there's different groups of people within the church that have problems with different groups of people. And so the pastor's like, I just need to keep the church from blowing up. So the pastor ends up going and they start either dealing with the person as if they understand the real issue, because they've heard from different people, but they don't know what the real issue is. The issue hasn't been dealt with in a scriptural way. He's not going to force people to deal with things in a scriptural way because they might fire him if he does. And he doesn't want to get fired. So you have this just gross injustice all over. The people don't want to do justly. The pastor doesn't feel like he can force them to do justly, and he's not willing to put his job on the line by asking them to. And so instead what you just do is you have people that so you have this compounding effect of people either being unjust to each other, or he figures out how to force out the person who was causing the problems, which brings peace for a period of time. But now the people know that if you put enough pressure on him, he'll take care of the problem. Total injustice all over the church. And the entire body becomes built around, and their practices become built around acting unjustly to one another. And it becomes full of gossip, full of backbiting, full of slander, full of harmful behavior, and has nothing to do with justice whatsoever.
And, people now, they don't hold church constitutions very seriously usually. And church covenants, they don't. Some churches do. I'm certainly not trying to make a blanket statement, but many of them do not. I know I was joining a church and I read part of the Constitution and went, nobody in this church is doing this. And they went, oh yeah, nobody does that. That's from 150 years ago. We don't do that kind of stuff anymore, even though it was biblical. But the point is, once you do that, where you do have a laid out process, but you've rejected that process, guess what? That's how you get tyranny, right? Most tyranny comes from a lack of due process. Most tyranny comes because I'm going to say, well, I like Jonathan and I don't like Charles, so I'm going to charge Charles and I'm going to ignore what Jonathan's doing. And that's how you get tyranny. Tyranny is the arbitrary application of justice in most cases. And so due process, and tyranny happens in the church frequently. this guy's important. Maybe he gives a lot of money, or I think he gives a lot of money, so I'm going to treat him one way and I'm going to treat other people a different way. Instead of saying, no, we have the responsibility to follow procedures, to do things the same for everybody, so that we don't have those biases because we want the guy who helps out, and we want the guy who gives money, we want the guy who can substitute and preach. We want them there, so we'll be biased for a whole bunch of different reasons. But in the end, it ends up being very destructive to the church because the duty of man is to do justly. So before we talk about elements of due processes, I was trying to organize how to go through here. One of the things that I think it's important to recognize again is just how easy it is to weaponize due process. And I thought, as I was thinking about it, it seems to me that Jesus Christ's trial is the best example of how people weaponize due process. Because at times they would even try to follow the biblical process a lot better than the U.S. does, but at the same time, it's not following it, and it's using it to destroy Christ. So when we think of the importance of due process, I think it's really useful to think of it in the context that, the people who reject due process are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, Pilate. They're the ones who reject due process. And so recognize if you don't think due process is important, whose side you're on. You're not on the side of Christ.
When you say weaponize due process, what you're saying is that somebody is using a form of process, pretending like it's the correct process, when really they've manipulated things.
Right, they change the process to
change
the
the
end
rules
that they
midstream.
want. Yeah, and they change the rules so they're unbiblical. They change the rules so that they're unjust and unfair, and so that they get the result they want, rather than saying, let's do justly.
They're still using a process. They're not just coming through and killing all their enemies,
right?
But they're going through motions, but they're not actually obeying the law. They're making it up as they go.
In weaponization, justice is not intended to be a weapon. I think that's really the key. In the end, in justice, I come into the situation and you come into the situation, and the goal should be we both want what is right to happen. We both want what is good to happen. And so I'm going to say what I know, and you're going to say what you know, and we're going to weigh it. And if I've done wrong, you're going to show me that I've done wrong. If you've done wrong, you're going to see that you've done wrong. This problem that we have between us will be resolved. Things will be split. But weaponization of justice is saying that justice is war. That in the end, there's no, all's fair in love and war. And so justice becomes all's fair in justice. And that is not true. That's never true. You do not have justice when whatever you do is okay. And so in the end, weaponization of process really is a shift from taking justice to be, we are going to go through the process to get the to let God achieve the outcome that he has desired in the situation, to I'm going to turn this into a weapon that I can wield to kill you with, because I don't care. The only thing I care about is that I win. Because,
the rules are in place to constrain people, often to constrain people who think they're doing the right thing, right. Because... that's why the rules are put in place.
Caiaphas.
Right.
It is better that one man die.
Right. He was trying to do what he thought was the best for Israel, or
right.
for the Jews.
Right. So when you're looking at how do I apply this if I'm not in a courtroom, well, the scriptural principles and even some of the principles we have in our country are telling you here's what your pragmatic heart is going to want to do, and watch out, because if you do that, you might very well be being unjust.
So we're supposed to esteem others better than ourselves. And when we think of due process, that's part of it, right? Because if you're saying, treat others as you would want to be treated, the same type concept is that when we look and we say, okay, this is the process we're going to use, we should always say, is this a process that would be acceptable if they were using it on me?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Love your neighbor as yourself. And all these things tie together. And so due process is the idea that somehow we should codify that, or have some, whether it's written or not, but some idea of this is what the process should be. So when you get into the moment where you're going, but I know this guy killed him, that you stick to the process. And what people want to do is instead they change the process so that they want to kill the guy because they're sure he's a murderer. So you change the process so the process becomes a weapon to destroy. And when we think about it, right, our system wasn't supposed to be adversarial in our court system to begin with. because the idea is there's a reason why defense attorneys are officers of the court. They're not supposed to be independent because the court is supposed to be seeking truth. They're supposed to be seeking justice. They're not supposed to be this adversarial thing where we kill the opponent, which is where we've gotten to. But we've gotten there because we've lost basic understanding of God is sovereign, and what we should be doing is seeking his will in the matter.
Right. It was intended to be complementary adversarial, if adversarial at all.
Though, they also recognize that people are, not, unless they are said your job is to protect this person's rights, that it's not going to happen. So
right.
That's why it's set up the way it is. That everyone's supposed to be seeking the truth, but on the other hand, we need to have someone whose job it is to watch out. Because
everybody walks in with a bias, so they want, if you have the judge and the prosecutor walking in with a bias, that you also have a defense attorney that walks in with a bias, but the bias shouldn't be such that it overrides the desire for truth.
So one of the core biblical principles of justice is found in verses like Deuteronomy 19:15. One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. So that's the core principle, that you need to be convicting someone on 2 or 3 witnesses and not one alone.
And when we look at our court system, one of the most common places where we just throw this idea out is in rape cases, where they go, well, it's he said, she said, how can you ever find out? How can you ever figure it out? And so therefore, we just have to just take her word, right? I mean, this is the Me Too movement. Just take her word. Because whatever she says, who would ever lie about being raped? Well, a lot of women in history have lied about being raped. It's not like it's never been done before. It's been done many times. And that doesn't mean that, that the issue is what you have to do is go back to process. Otherwise, you just start to say, well, this is impossible. He'll always get away with it. Well, no, he won't. You have to trust God. And you have to say, even though she said she was raped, you don't know.
And there's this part of it where there was an attempt to deny. The way that women protected themselves was by not being alone with a man under certain circumstances. This was a way that had been established. They would have a chaperone. They would take their brother with them. They would take someone who wouldn't put up with certain types of behavior, and this was how they protected themselves. And the idea is now they want to say that shouldn't be. You shouldn't have to do that.
I should be able to invite a man back to my room and not have any risk at all, as opposed to before. You'd have to have somebody else there, a brother or sister, somebody there. So if nothing else, you had a witness.
Right. And so, there's been this shift. The fact that you can even entertain the idea that all women deserve to be believed in a special way is a sign of abandoning due process. The idea that men don't deserve to be believed just as equally or not as equally.
Right.
It's a rejection of due process. It's a rejection of justice.
And I think you look at these, and this is one where the U.S. really doesn't have this, and historically hasn't had this as much as a lot of the other ones. That there's you can't. There's no rule saying you can't be convicted on one witness. And it happens a lot. And if you look at, look at the false convictions where it's been proven by DNA that the person didn't do it, and how many of them have 2 or 3 witnesses? A lot of them have 1 witness or no witness that they actually committed this crime. And so you see that injustice comes from it.
And again, as you connected to the trial of Christ, even though they were willing to accept false testimony, they had to have it agree, right? Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward. So they kept even trying to get them to come forward. They kept trying to find witnesses because they still said you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. So even when we think about our system and compare that to the evil trial of Christ, the trial of Christ was more just. That's a pretty frightening thing, because that was one thing that they did say, you have to have 2 witnesses to agree. Now they ended up changing it at the end and going, we've decided this, so it doesn't matter. But, at first they were saying you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. That's the only way truth is established. And, we've watched this play out in the, especially in the public sphere, especially with the Supreme Court hearings. You look at Justice Thomas and, Anita Hill. Anita Hill's story was laughable. I mean, it just was blatantly false. I mean, I think there's even, I forget who the senator was that basically went to Joe Biden, who was the chairman of the committee, and said, if she doesn't start giving better answers that sound credible, I'm going to say you're a liar. And this was a Democrat that was trying to, I mean, you know, it was just, they just didn't care. It was the same thing that was happening here. You just bring somebody that will lie to stop the witness. And, you know, with Brett Kavanaugh in Ford and her coming forward where, you know, they went to everybody that she said would support it and all of them said, nope, didn't happen. You're making it up. Right. And yet the Democrats still go, we know it's true. And so, and again, that's weaponization of process and the idea we'll just find somebody, and Americans are gullible enough and they won't require due process enough that they'll listen to that and believe that. I mean, Anita Hill still gets huge amounts of money for every speech she makes just because she tried to stop Clarence Thomas from being on the Supreme Court, even though she was clearly a liar if you watch the testimony. I mean, it's just not credible testimony. And so, you know, this idea that, you know, the Pharisees would do this and the Sadducees, well, this is still happening today. And if we want to stop it, we have to stop saying, yeah, we're just going to believe whoever comes up and says something against somebody that we don't like.
So another principle of due process is that you're allowed to do cross-examination, or effectively that hearing one side is not enough. And this, you can see this in Proverbs 18:17, where it says, the first one to plead his cause seems right, until his neighbor comes and examines him.
And that is pretty much the definition of cross-examination.
Right.
I mean, and so if you want truth, you have to allow that cross-examination.
And this is one of the things I was meaning about, particularly in your home, is it's really easy to get to let one child establish facts. And it's, you know, it's amazing how whenever you start asking some questions to the one child, you know your child, you start, and all of a sudden the story starts falling apart. And the story, you know, there will be this really rock solid case of, I'm just sitting in my room and she came in and she hit me in the side of the head, and then you find out that he wasn't sitting in his room. He hit her in the head, ran in the room, set, you know what I mean, and all this other information comes out, and it's really important to allow to teach your children that you are someone who will listen, that you will allow them to ask questions, that you'll allow them to bring things up, because otherwise you'll teach them that there is no justice. And there is this part of it where they should have an expectation of justice in your household, and we should have an expectation of justice in the world.
And, you know, the 2 or 3 witnesses definitely has application beyond, you know, courts, you know, church courts or civil courts. But, it's not something that, as individuals, we just ignore something unless there's 2 or 3 witnesses. But this one, I mean, definitely applies to everyone, directly in all kinds of situations that, someone tells you something, well, you need to look into that. If you're going to base anything you do off of that, you have to talk to them about it and talk to the other person, see what they have to say.
This one ties back to 2 or 3 witnesses, because cross-examination is sort of a way to invalidate witnesses.
Right.
Because you could have a case where you could have 3 witnesses, but then in cross-examination, the witness gets destroyed. And so the law does not say just because 3 people said it that the jury, the person evaluating the case, has to go, well, 3 people said it. So because in the end, the cross-examination can show that they're really not a valid witness, that the things that they said, you shouldn't be listening to them. And so these things, they touch on one another.
In the trial of Jesus again, in Mark 14:56 through 59, it says, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. And then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did their testimony agree. And so there's certain things that you're supposed to do, like you said, to validate the testimony. Right? If their testimony didn't agree, I don't think it's because the 2 of them were standing in the room talking at the same time. What they did was they had one witness come in, state his case. And remember, these are people who had determined to kill Christ. And they have one person come in and say, this is what happened. And then they have somebody else come in. They even both say, I'm going to tear down this temple with 3 hands, or in 3 days I'll build it up again. But yet they had such a process that even though they were trying to make up the same lie, they couldn't make up the same lie. And so like really basic things, like you don't examine one witness in front of the other, because then the other witness goes, yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Because then you have them agree. And so these are the patterns that even wicked men knew better. And we do this kind of stuff all the time, where we don't think they need to be examined.
And the context for the verse from Proverbs, I mean, it certainly applies in a courtroom, but there's no context in Proverbs that's saying this is talking about courtrooms. Right. I mean, that's your antidote against gossip right there, is you don't just take what one person tells you and say that that's the end of the matter. You've got to wait until you've got other information before it's actionable for you.
And even you examine the person that brought the gossip. Where do you hear this from? Are you sure that he wasn't doing this? You're accusing of this. Right. You're the neighbor that as soon as you hear that, you should immediately go, you're saying these things, but why should I believe you? Who else can verify these things, right? I mean, that's what happens when you and you said with children that their story that seems so rock solid falls apart. This happens with adults all the time, that their rock solid story just crumbles when you do any examination. But now the point is, we're to the point in our society where a lot of times we go, oh, there shouldn't be any examination. How can you ask her difficult questions? She was raped.
Right.
Instead of going, no, she has to be examined because she's claiming that somebody raped her.
Hearsay is a special case of what this kind of principle is fighting against, because you're bringing something in that can't be cross-examined.
Right.
And that's why it's excluded as admissible evidence.
Yes. And it's the sort of thing where, I mean, just recently there was a big case, Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, and there were lots of clips of it of Johnny Depp kind of getting frustrated with his case. He would say something, so-and-so told me, hearsay. And you see him getting frustrated with them calling hearsay on him. But in the end, he won the case. I mean, he didn't need those things to establish his case, and if he had used them, it would have been false. He couldn't say what someone else told him. If you want them to say it, have them come in here and have them say it under oath. And if they're not willing to say it under oath, we shouldn't examine it. You know what I mean? And those principles really matter.
And with hearsay, because like you said, you can't examine it, the reality is a lot of people say things with different motives than what the person heard thought they had.
Right.
And so you say, well, he said this, and that's because of this and this and this. And the reason that can't be a valid witness is because you have no idea why they said it. And since you can't examine them, you can't say, well, why would you say this? And so often it comes back that the reason that they said it was completely different than the hearer decided to impute to their statement.
Yes. And this goes on in churches all the time. I mean, this is one of the ways where in churches, telling someone else what you heard someone else say, saying these things to other people, now you've caused this other person to have a bad opinion of this other person because you've now represented a third party person's statement in a context where it can't be evaluated. I mean, these things happen all the time in churches.
And people don't think that they should worry about hearsay. And
frequently it's elders. It's not uncommon for elders to do this in churches. Pastors, be really clear.
And another thing you touched on there was, lying, and that's another thing where our country, in the courts as well as among individuals, really falls short. Is that there's not much consequences for if you lie. I mean, technically, you can get charged with perjury, but it doesn't happen all that much, and that's a serious thing. In under this biblical law, you get the punishment that you were trying to put upon someone if you testify falsely against them. And, it's easy in the home. I've seen certain people where they let, their kids say whatever they want to defend themselves. Then, if they were lying, well, okay, I'm going to punish you for what you did. And it's not like, well, you've added on a bunch of other things now that are very serious and that can't be tolerated, that you just will lie about, whoever you want in order to get out of
Eating
something.
the cookie wasn't a big deal. Lying about it and trying to pin it on your sister was a really, really big deal.
And I just remember reading the decision from Zingac, who is the one who runs our prosthetic clinic, that reading the decision where he basically got convicted of having slandered. And you read this decision and it's, well, yeah, the witnesses against him lied here. Basically, there was no truth in but they seem so sincere. I believe every word they said. And these people, yeah, they have evidence and they can prove that they weren't lying, but they just seem like liars to me. So I'm going to dismiss all this evidence. I'm going to accept things by people that I know are liars that are proven to lie under oath, and so I'm going to convict based on that. And I bring that example because that happens all the time. We were in an arbitration case, and we proved unquestionably that the person was lying. No doubt. Proved it clear. We had emails that proved it. And the judge basically, who was a retired federal judge, Superior Court judge, basically went, and didn't think that the fact that he was a liar, this witness, meant that you shouldn't take anything. Instead, he took everything that he said as true, even though it was proven that he lied. And so this is just where we are as a society, is we don't think that if somebody's willing to lie to get their agenda through, that you shouldn't trust anything that they say, which is basically what the perjury laws are, right? Is that you're supposed to say, you perjured yourself, you're caught in perjury. Therefore, number one, you're not fit to testify anymore. Number two, you receive the penalty that you tried to get imposed on the other person. And as a society, we don't think lying matters.
And then, then there's the other side of it where, you can take that too far where, honest mistakes that are understandable are then taken as, well, now you can believe nothing they said because they made one mistake, therefore throw out absolutely everything, when what they said was, easily explainable as a mistake.
Right, and I'm not saying that you don't give them a chance to explain how this, reconciles and stuff. I definitely agree with that. So, I mean, another thing, as I was saying before, they're doing the January 6th. I think they're doing public hearings again tonight while we record this. And, this is the January 6th committee. You don't allow any cross-examination. I remember, and just to see the shift that's happened, I remember the Soviet show trials in the 80s and stuff, in the 70s. And the Soviet show trials is pretty much identical to the January 6th trials, where you bring up the witnesses that will say what you want to say. You have the crowd in the room cheering the way you want to cheer. Now they have television where the broadcasters all go, oh, yeah, isn't that wonderful, the great point they made, including Fox News and everything else. And none of them, they say it, but they don't then go, well, we're not going to cover it because this just isn't just. This is just contrary to justice. And like there was the woman who comes out and says, hearsay, I heard about this and I heard about this. I heard how he tried to grab the steering wheel and all this other stuff. You hear it, and she tried to grab the steering wheel of his limousine, which has a glass partition in it. Now, later they find out that he wasn't even in the limousine that day and all these other things. But nobody goes, well, she's tainted as a witness. Forget it. Instead, they go, well, this is the only thing that's out there.
It
so
was
people
all hearsay,
will believe
right?
It. It was all hearsay. It was all without cross-examination. And we just need to go, whether he's guilty or not isn't as important as saying, why are we having show trials? Because that's a rejection of due process, which means when a society rejects due process, you've gotten to tyranny, and you should expect to be tyrannized.
Right. If a rich former president,
right, if a multi-billionaire can be treated that way,
right, then you should have no expectation. If they decide that they want to roll over you, they will, and no one will stand up to defend you, because they didn't stand up to defend him.
So, you're really talking about just twisting the law and making it bear on your own purposes. And that, again, you go back to Christ's trial, Matthew 26, starting in verse 63. But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look now, you have heard his blasphemy.
But he was the Son of God.
And what further need do we have of witnesses?
Right. He said he's the Son of God, so what we're going to say is, by definition, he can't be, even though we've been looking for the Son of God to come. We're just going to say he can't be. And so they twist the law, they twist the definition of who's the Son of God to say it can't be Christ.
And let's be honest, they had witnesses of who the Messiah would be. They had witnesses of who it would be, and Jesus Christ had fulfilled all those.
And Jesus Christ said, you want witnesses? The lame walk. The blind see.
Right.
The dead are raised. You have your witnesses.
Right. It's the same thing he said to John when John
That's
came.
what I was
that's what I'm
talking
saying.
about.
I mean, right. They had the exact same evidences that John had, and they said, we're not accepting these.
Right, but the bigger issue is that in terms of twisting the law is that, by the way that they're interpreting the law is that because they believe the Messiah was going to come, when the Messiah came, they could convict him of blasphemy. Because they're saying, because you said you are the Messiah, who we believe is coming, you are therefore... Because it's one thing to say, well... Because like now, if someone's, say there's a blasphemy law. If someone says they're Christ, then, well, okay, now they're a blasphemer. But you can't just say because you said you're Christ.
Unless all the dead raise at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you have to. You can't say we have further need of witnesses. You have to have a witness to say, here's why. He says he's the Christ. Now let's prove that he's not the Christ.
Yes. If you can arrest the one coming in the clouds, you're
yeah, then you're good. Especially when everybody raises from the dead at the same time. Then you're not the Christ.
Right. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, They have said we automatically falsify anyone who claims to be the person we're waiting for.
And I mean, I see this now, right? There were rioters that broke into the Capitol, but they're not called rioters. They're called insurrectionists. Well, they didn't commit insurrection. Everybody knows, if you understand what insurrection is, they weren't even trying to commit insurrection. But yet, what do? They're guilty of insurrection.
Walk through the stanchions taking pictures of you.
Right. And I'm not saying that there weren't a few that may have desired, when you allow people and you listen to them saying, well, we know this is insurrection, even though they don't charge anybody with insurrection. I mean, this is a really dangerous thing and really damaging to justice and damaging to trust between the people and the government. And people talk about how everything's so divided. Well, everything's so divided because we've rejected due process. We've said there can be one standard. If the Republicans are in office, there's one standard that's against the Democrats. And if the Democrats are in office, there's a different standard that's against the Democrats. And there's no general standard. You look at even Donald Trump's first impeachment hearing, where he's impeached for asking for evidence from Zelensky. Well, since when is that an impeachable offense? That's just insane. If Zelensky didn't have any evidence, the answer is you don't have any evidence. And if you believe that the evidence has to be examined, then you go, if he tries to falsify evidence, we'll probably figure it out pretty quick. Because if he falsifies evidence, there's not going to be any bank transfers. It's about money. It's about corruption. You can find all these things because it goes to the banking system. I mean,
right.
In our modern society, it's pretty hard to hide that stuff. And yet they go, oh, he's trying to have evidence falsified. Well, that isn't even what he asked for. Now, did he ask for evidence on a political opponent? Sure, that made statements that looked pretty questionable. And now we find out a lot more about it. But so we just need to recognize how important this is when we start to set up these standards that are arbitrary, that they go, we don't like how he spoke to Zelensky. Who cares?
Right.
Instead, we impeach.
And this is one of the things that was, a critical event leading up to the War for Independence is with the Boston Massacre, where the British fire upon the Patriots, but then the Patriots led by John Adams say, well, I'm actually going to argue that they should be found innocent. They should not be They should not be convicted of murder because they were legitimately defending themselves. Even though these are the people that we hate, we say are invading us and occupying us and it's wrong for a whole bunch of reasons. Yet still doesn't mean we can attack them however we want. And that set things up to go on a way where they're going to some extent follow the law throughout the revolution. And now, in many instances, is just kind of rewrite the law to do whatever it takes to get back at your opponents.
And we look back at the revolution and we pretend like it's good to be rebellious, when even though there were elements of rebellion going on, there was also a lot of you read the Declaration of Independence and the reasons why they said they could do this. There was due process followed for a very long time. That before they
were basically arguing that King George III was not following due process.
Exactly.
That he had to do things in a certain way, and he refused to do that. And part of his due process was, as the King of Virginia, he had responsibility to the Virginian colonies, that he was pillaging them for England. And that's right. The arguments is that he was in violation of due process. That's why they had the right to dispose him as king.
And
after
they
making multiple appeals.
For years. This was right. So it's really important to understand these things.
And it's something that we've forgotten, which is one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, is it's important to remember these things. It's important to recognize. Why would John Adams, who became the second president of the United States, why would he become the chief defense attorney for British soldiers that killed revolutionaries? I mean, because they deserve to be defended, because due process is important.
It's also important that you know what the jurisdictions are. You know who the authorities are. For example, Deuteronomy 21:18 and following. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear.
They didn't get to choose where to take him. Yeah, they had to bring him out of his city and take him to the elders of his city. And, even like there's where you find a dead body and you measure the distance from the city. And God is pretty, it's pretty important to understand who has jurisdiction, because then you don't get to pick and choose, right? I know this judge likes me better than this judge. These elders like me and these elders don't. So I'm gonna say, take me to these elders, right? And this happens all the time. This is a very common thing that happens in our court system, is people choose the jurisdiction because they recognize if they're, in the 9th District, which is out in California, they're going to get a really liberal decision. If they pick, the district that's in Oklahoma, they'll get a very different decision. And our judges in the federal courts, people pick and choose. That's why there's even, like, when you go into a certain jurisdiction, that if there's multiple judges in that jurisdiction, they usually do a random selection of which judge you get.
Right.
And it's to try to break this. But in our system, we've also set up ways that you can get around it.
Shop around for who you
can shop around.
That's interesting, because I saw this passage and I did not think that that's what you were going to do when you were pulling this for jurisdiction, because I thought it was going to talk about how the parents had jurisdiction over the son to a certain point until his offense rose to a level that they couldn't handle, and then the jurisdiction passes over to the elders of the city.
That's true. That's just not what I was going for.
Yeah. Okay.
Because and part of it is that I'm just watching what's happening in America, and I see how we're violating it and all the time. And right, I mean, there's a reason why people love, like the Democrats love to have people tried in the Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. voted something like 98%, some ridiculous percentage, for President Biden. Well, you get a jury of those, and you try them on contempt of Congress, you try them on all kinds of things. Well, guess what? They're guilty before they walk in, because they hate these people. They'll openly state that they hate these people. And most people won't stand up to their neighbor if some of their neighbors have that level of vitriol. And so what you get is a very biased judgment. And that's where we are as a nation, in the shopping around for courts and all these other things. And again, you see that during Christ's trial, right? They go to the Sanhedrin, they go to Pilate, they go to Herod, they go to Pilate. And why did the Sanhedrin have a trial? They thought it was blasphemy. They were trying to put him to death. Well, one thing they knew is they didn't have the jurisdiction to put him to death. That's what the Bible says. They can't put him to death. So why did they have any trial before the Sanhedrin? There was no need to. They just did it because that they knew they would get the conviction there. And then they could use that conviction to try to leverage it with Pilate.
That is a form of weaponization.
Right.
And this is exactly, in the end, you're saying, I can't do this justly. So how can I use what I have to get what I want? And it's using influence. It's taking the blindfold off of justice, because I want you to look at the fact that we've said these horrible things about him, and I want you to take it into account, even though you're not supposed to.
Louisiana, the legislature passed a law that said if Roe versus Wade is overturned, abortion becomes illegal. So what they do is they shop for a judge that's in New Orleans. What an odd place, right? The most liberal place. And they go there and they get them to stop the shutting down of abortion through the whole state. I mean, this happened just in the last few days. Well, it happened a couple times, but the most recent decision was in the last few days. And I mean, this is just playing games where you're not saying we want justice. What you're saying is I'll pick the judge that will give me the decision that I want.
You're saying you don't actually really believe in justice. You just believe in power. And you're going to do what you can to collect power, exercise power, buy power. But you don't actually believe in, you don't have any principles.
And this was a huge jump forward that happened at the beginning of Trump's presidency, but it's flipped and it's happened the other way in Biden's presidency, where all of a sudden you have these federal judges where they do, even though they're just in one district and they're supposed to just make a decision for the district, they decide that it's for the whole country. During President Trump's term, there's been far more of those than there were ever before that. But then Biden gets in, and what happens? The conservative justices, they do the same thing. They start to pass things and they make it national. They don't make it just to their own jurisdiction. And so this idea of shopping jurisdictions, this idea of ignoring jurisdictions, this is all rejecting due process. And again, due process is really important. So the example that's been recent in the news is Colbert sent his staff into the Capitol. And basically they got charged with the same crimes that the vast majority of the same misdemeanors that the vast majority of people that went in on January 6th got charged with. And that looks like, okay, so the courts will, no. They did it with a different court system. And that court system typically charges people $50 and lets them go. Or maybe they do 40 hours of community service and let them go, which is exactly what they did with Colbert, his staff. But the other court system where they did the January 6th, even though it's the same charge, it happened in the same place, in the same building, same exact charges, they did it in a different court system, and those court systems are sentencing people to 30 days to a year for the same crimes. Now, I'm not saying there weren't other people that are charged with more things, but I'm saying they chose which court based on whether they wanted to let them go or not.
Sometimes the details of even the argument was they were in a place where they were not told by police officers to leave, which is the exact case of some of the people on January 6th, where you have evidence that they were in an area where even police officers were fist bumping them or doing other things like that.
Directing them in.
But their reasoning was even identical, and they've treated them completely differently under the law.
And the way it works is that federal judges they compare their sentencing. So you're not allowed to go out of a certain range of sentencing, or you get basically your hand slapped, or you get penalties if you go outside of the range. If you go too far out of the average for the judges in that court system. So they do it in two different court systems so that both judges can go, hey, everybody does $50, and the other one goes, everybody does 3 months. And that they can do all the standards that the Congress put in place to prevent this, so they just split the court system so they can still do the same thing. It's no different.
We have two laws. We have two court systems. We have two justices.
Right. If you're on the establishment side, and I don't think it's Democrat and Republican, I think it's establishment side versus not establishment side.
Right. So, that kind of ties into partiality. And so Deuteronomy 16:19, you shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. And we've mentioned it multiple times already, but partiality is a big, big deal. And this is one that, definitely goes down into the home, and it definitely goes down into churches. In the home, it's really easy to have favorite children. It's easy, and it's easy not to think of them as favorite. It's the children who their strengths are your strengths. Their strengths align with your strengths. I'm not even saying they remind you of you, because frequently the child who reminds you of you drives you crazy. But they've learned to mirror you, and so they like to push. They try to fight for the things you fight for, and they can get in a situation where you don't judge them as harshly as the child who really irritates you. They've learned not to annoy you. Maybe they've learned to make you laugh. I learned in school, if you can make the teacher laugh, you're not going to get in trouble. And so if you learn how to, so the one who can make you laugh about something, you let him off the hook. And the other one, he annoys you, and you never laugh at him, and he gets the really hard spankings. And it's just, and the church is the same way. There are people who are liked, and there are people who never quite fit in. And the people who never quite fit in, they get in trouble a lot more than the people who everybody likes.
Right, or they get ignored, or they get,
Right.
They just get treatment that's not, they don't get blessed. Sometimes it's not even that they receive punishment. It's more that they don't get blessed. Nobody tries to help them, come alongside them, encourage them. And, in 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about that the weaker parts they have more honor because they are covered, and that they have to be covered by the church. But yet we forget that. Instead we go, no, the ones that we like, the ones that are powerful, the ones that are well-spoken, those kind of people, those are the ones that you want to help, as opposed to the people that need the help the most.
Right.
One thing, the partiality, you see it with Barabbas and Christ, right? I mean, where Pilate knows the one guy's a murderer and he knows the other one's innocent, but the Jews really want Christ to be put to death and the murderer to go free. So he puts Christ to death and lets the murderer go free. I mean, that's as bad a partiality as you can ever get. In the end, Christ was crucified because Pilate showed partiality to the Jews.
Right.
And at that point, you saw just when Pilate does that, the complete breakdown of process. After a long evening of it, where Pilate basically just looks at the mob and says, "Okay, you guys,
I'm going to wash my hands of this. His
you,
blood's on you.
You can have this one, or you can have this one." And there's no process there anymore.
They've just essentially become animals.
And in the end, I mean, hey, when you look at what's going on with Donald Trump, there's an attempt to go, the Democrats want this so bad, and the Republicans they're trying to get their base to go, look, let's just write him off. I mean, and I'm not saying, I mean, this has nothing to do with whether it would be good. I'm not going to vote for him. I'm not. I don't care what happens. I'm not voting for Donald Trump. But there's this part of it where there's this. This is Pilate. It's putting somebody out there and it's going, look, aren't you tired of defending him? Let's just let them have him.
Be crucified.
Let them take him and Donald Trump's nowhere near as innocent. I mean, he's not innocent like Jesus Christ. But that's the point is with justice you don't have to be. You just have to not be guilty of what they're accusing you of. You just have to not be guilty of that. If they accuse him of being a jerk, if they accuse him of not being nice, they accuse him of being selfish, but they don't want to accuse him of that because they're selfish. They're not. They have to accuse him of something. That's really what's going on here. And there's a point where the nation just goes, yeah, let's just let them have this one. And when you do that, you're unjust. You've become partial. You've said, yeah, I don't really feel like defending. It's just, it's not worth it. And that's injustice.
And one of the worst ways that I see this, that it's been happening the last, 8 years or something, is the fake consent agreements. So here's what happens. A city, or the FBI will sue a city because say that they don't have, they'll say that they're biased against blacks in the police force. In the very liberal Department of Justice and the very liberal major city will get together and they'll write up a consent agreement so that they don't have to go to court and be judged according to the law, where basically everybody says that they're guilty and that they'll change all these things, which if they had to do it through the political process, it would never pass. It wouldn't even come close to passing. And then they have this consent agreement where they say, well, this has now become law. And they do this all the time when they have the power on both sides. They were doing this especially at the end of the Obama administration. I'm sure they've started again in the Biden administration, where they do this where it's just a way to have no justice whatsoever because you can pick and choose what laws you want. You can pick and choose how to give money to them. You can pick and choose what things, and you can basically bypass all the people and their ability to speak through their elected representatives, because in the end you go, it's a court decision. There's nothing we can do. I mean, it's very sleazy and very partial, and they do this. This has become a very common means to put things in place that the voters would never accept.
Right. I wasn't familiar with that. That's almost too clever.
Right.
I mean, it's horrible.
They did in North Carolina for the last election that some of the early voting rules, somebody sued, and then they came to an agreement that they're going to throw out the election law, and the judge approves it. So now the election law's gone because the Board of Elections came to an agreement with whoever sued them. With
Governor Cooper.
Okay.
And so the election laws became what Governor Cooper wanted because they just use this consent agreement method to overcome all laws.
And this is the real, and when everybody talks about still in the election, there's all these fake things that people talk about. But if an election was stolen or if it gets stolen, it's much more likely to be stolen through those means.
Another thing that people do is they make it a way to weaponize process is to make it very inconvenient, right? You, instead of making the trial at the time where you can have your witnesses there so there can be a fair thing, what you do is you schedule the trial at a time where you can't get there. And, obviously one example is Christ, that during his trial, it's all night, right? It's in the dark. It's so that there can't be people that will defend him. And so Inconvenience, this was a classic thing that King George did again, where they would just make it so that they met all of a sudden out, like the legislature would meet someplace out, so only his people can meet there. And then they go, oh, look, they voted for exactly what King George wanted them to vote for. And so they play those games, so you can use inconvenience as a weapon. That's a really useful weapon.
It's a way that the rich can sometimes do this to inconvenience the poor by either setting high barriers for things, choosing a venue that's in a difficult location for them to come to, all sorts of things that can be allowed to be done. It's one of the reasons why we say we'll assign a lawyer to someone, is because there's a part of it where if someone has to pay for a lawyer and they don't have money, then someone with money can just sue them, and all of a sudden they're out of luck. And so it's these are aspects of due process that we've tried to do to prevent inconvenience from being leveraged.
I know that, like in Australia, the law is basically, especially civil law, is that you can just keep deposing people and just keep doing things until you drive out the weaker party. So if somebody, if it's for $5 million and one party has $2 million and the other party has $100 million, they just spend $2.1 million on their legal fees, and then the other party has to drop the case. And so this is a common technique to use, is just wear them out.
And even in the U.S., I don't think you get a court-appointed attorney for civil cases.
You don't get a court-appointed attorney, but the rules of evidence are such that there's only certain things they can do. They can't just keep extending it and extending it and
They're not
extending
supposed
it.
to be able to.
They're not supposed to be able to, but like you said, there can be judges that do that. But typically what you do is you go to the judge and say, they don't need this deposition. They already had this deposition.
Right.
And the judge will go, yeah, you don't need that.
But you do have things like, if I had a case that wasn't a small claims case against a major company, I am not going to have money to win that case,
right.
unless a lawyer does it for free, because I just won't have the money to pay lawyers.
Because basically, if you go to court, you should expect to spend $250,000 to walk in the door.
It's that. Oh, never mind. I can afford it.
I thought you could, Joshua. I was surprised.
Who are you going to take down?
All of them, one by one.
But this was common enough that it was put into the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 6, Clause 1. They shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses, and going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house. They shall not be questioned in any other place. And so what they would do is, right, one way to make it inconvenience is you arrest them and then they can't get to the place. Right. And so this had been a common practice in England. And so, in the U.S., we saw this, we put it in our Constitution, and now we don't care. And it ties to 1 John 1:7. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus Christ, his son, cleanses us from all sin. When you're not trying to find the truth, then you try to make things inconvenient. If your real desire is to find the truth, you work to make things convenient. Because if your desire is to know what really happened, then you don't walk in darkness, you don't hide it. You try to do it in ways so that people can be in the light and that you can have the process in the light. One of the signs of it being somebody that's trying to walk in darkness rather than light is they literally walk in darkness. They try to make it so people can't see what they're doing.
And maybe that sounds like something that only happens in shady legislative meetings, but, once upon a time we were all at a church meeting where someone insisted that it go all night and that it wasn't going to stop. And it's not a sign that that person was pursuing justice.
Right. And that wasn't any of us at this table that forced it to go all night, just for clarity.
And it's important to remember, as we've mentioned, that this needs to apply to the church, and the principles need to be brought to bear, not just in the civil sphere. And a verse along those lines is 1 Corinthians 6, 1-6. Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous, and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then you have judgments concerning things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one, who will be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers.
And even when you get to that end, right, and that before unbelievers, the only way that the world learns due process is by the church teaching it. Due process is not natural. What's natural is to weaponize process. Every wicked government, even governments that are not nearly as wicked as other governments, they weaponize process. This is the norm. And, it's not Pilate and Herod aren't like these weird examples, but today they've been constrained by the church. And so when we're seeing the behavior not being constrained by the church, it's because the church isn't modeling the right behavior. The church is not shining forth a difference between it and the world. And when you look at due process, most churches are really bad at due process. They just don't think it's important. And it's interesting because you go back to like Knox and stuff, and one of the first things he does when he goes back to Scotland is write the Book of Church Order to say, these things really matter. The process of excommunication really matters. How do you judge witnesses? All these things, they really matter. And the church has like completely lost that. And it really transformed Scotland by doing that.
We should say the Presbyterian Church has kept it better than the Presbyterians have kept it better than the Baptists. I mean, and I'm not sure. I don't know of another denomination that's kept it better that's Orthodox. I do think that's to their credit.
And I think that, the reason that you think due process is important goes back to one of the first things we said was due process, and the importance of it flows directly from the doctrine of is God sovereign or not over all things. If he's sovereign over all things, due process is the right answer. If he's not, then you need to get the end that you think is the best end. And so the only churches that you should expect to fight for due process are those that believe in a sovereign God.
I mean, and it's really, this verse says that it is more important for the church to have due process than government. You said, but it is, there's this part of it where you go, well, government, and then maybe the church, and no, it is the church by far is supposed to have and uphold due process. To the point that you don't go to the world to get, you would say, I expect to get better justice in the church than I do from the world. And that is not true. I don't know churches where that's true.
And and the answer, like for gossip, right, is that we look out in the world, we say gossip's evil. And then in the church, people don't say gossip's evil. They say, oh, love covers a multitude of sins. Yeah, I said something about that. But, I love him. Love covers a multitude of sins. So we use these Bible verses to cover up what is really unjust and unfair. And I even heard of a man that I know that, this is basically what, he gets charged with something by the elders, and what they keep going is, but doesn't love cover a multitude of sins? As they keep repeating the sins. And it's like, no, don't gossip. Whether you're elders, whether you're not elders, don't gossip. Gossip is, and we need to do a podcast on it sometime about what gossip is. But gossip is really where you're trying to use words to tear other people down. And there's a just way to use words and an unjust way to use words. And gossip is a good way to try to get people to be tried without being examined, without having 2 or 3 witnesses, to basically be a morsel that goes into the inward parts of the belly that makes people think evil about somebody else without any basis.
And there's also at the same time, there are churches that church members have a responsibility to speak out about things. And there are churches that try to use gossip as a means to weaponize the process so that they silence those who have an obligation to speak out while they go around and slander people and actually gossip. And so, gossip.
You don't have 2 or 3 witnesses. You're not allowed to raise that against an elder, right? That's a classic line that's used when you go, well, he did this to me. Did he do this to anybody else? And even if you're gently trying to find that out, you get accused with with not having 2 or 3 witnesses, because if you can keep the witnesses dispersed, it doesn't matter what you do. You'll never be caught.
Right. And so, it's really important. One thing I do want to say is I know I mentioned that there's due process in the home, and at the same time, the father is not constrained in the same way that a judge is. Like, there are times where I'll have two children. It's very unclear exactly what has happened, but I'm pretty sure both of them need a spanking. And because in the end, the father is limited to the rod, and the rod is one of those things where God says there's times where your father chastened you, this wasn't that big of a deal. And that really is the answer, is if you end up getting chastened, this isn't the worst thing. It's very different than somebody who's depriving you of your life, who's depriving you of property, who's doing these things, who can be a tyrant over you and destroy you. The father is constrained in less of a way. And at the same time, we should not think that we do not have to, these principles are real principles that we should consider.
You don't need 2 or 3 witnesses when you see your kid do something wrong.
Right.
I mean, the whole discussion, just thinking about it in the church, and just if you were to ask the average churchman, hey, tell me about due process in the church, they don't even know where to start. It's just not something on anybody's radar. We're so loose with our connection to church covenants or church constitutions or church membership. It's something that our understanding of oaths and vows is so diminished that we don't really think that the church has processes that it has to follow, other than maybe Matthew 18,
right?
But there's many other ones too.
And Thessalonians 3 and 1 Corinthians 5, and there's a whole list of other ones.
But even just processes for, hey, there's a way to take communion. Don't jostle each other. I know, but Paul's talking about due process for, here's how you're supposed to come together to do this thing that God said to do.
And God kind of says, and if you ignore the due process, guess what? I'll start killing you. I mean, he's not playing around. We want to think that, these things aren't that serious until you get to the end of that chapter where he goes, and some have slept because of this. And so God's very serious about it. I mean, another area where I see it in the church is that there's different rules for the elders than there are for members of the congregation. Different standards of behaviors for the elders than there are for members of the congregation. And to some extent, that's legitimate that there should be. An elder should be held to a higher standard, but that's not usually what happens. What usually happens is he's such a great blessing to the church, we'll overlook his sin. I mean, I know I've done this before, which was sinful, is to just overlook the sin of people because you're going, well, they're such a great blessing to the church all over. No, he was given much is expected. The standard goes up, not down. But so often elders think, well, I don't have to worry about gossiping. I can say whatever I want, but the members of the church, they better not gossip. And so just that partiality, I mean, we just need to recognize, and all you have to do is look at the people who have fallen in the last 10 years that were renowned church leaders, and you go, yeah, this destroyed them, right? We did one on Ravi Zacharias. Well, there was a lot of people at RZIM that had enough idea to really suspect things about Ravi Zacharias. And did anything happen? No. Why? Well, he was held to a different standard than other people.
I mean, it's because you hold them to a different standard. You are literally ignoring their sins.
Right.
And instead of dealing with their sins, they just skate along and their sins get worse.
Right, because that's the nature of sin, is works like leaven. If we want better due process in the state, like, and to go back to the January 6th committee, I mean, they're hiding a whole bunch of stuff, like a huge amount of stuff. They do 12 hours of interview with somebody, and then they play 30 seconds, and they hide the rest. That's just not how it should work. If you want to walk in righteousness, if you want to walk in justice, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, is what Ephesians 5:11 says. And this is what we should be doing. We should be, and I've seen it with elders where they go off into a room and make decisions about people and don't tell people in the church that they affect it. They do discipline without it. They know about things, but they ignore it in one case, and then they're really public about it in another case. I can think of a case where a man stole all kinds of money from a church. Not that big of a deal, but another man comes along and he steals, 10 computers, and, which was a fraction of what the other man stole. And we need to excommunicate him. And the other person is, we'll just let him go off scot-free. I mean, this is just a horrible way to do things. And so often the church complains about what the state does. But if the church isn't going to look at itself it basically loses the right to complain, because the light comes from the church. And if the church isn't willing to shine forth the light, then stop complaining about the darkness.
This isn't like if you want to.
Right.
And it doesn't mean you see your brother make a tiny little mistake. I have to go point. But I mean, there is this part of it where, I mean, usually in the church, it's not tiny little things that people are talking about. It's things that are tearing them apart. It's things that are destroying them, and people know about it. And it gets to these states because we don't deal with small things in a loving way. We don't deal with things and we go, hey, you're doing this. This is gonna harm you down the road. This is gonna cause you pain down the road. It's caused me pain. I can show you. I can pull up my sleeve and show you the scars. And we say these things in a loving way. But there's this part of it where due process actually requires you to engage in the process. We did an episode on church polity, and in it we talked about how the church isn't viewed as, the ecclesia was like a legislative body where members were like senators. And there's this part of it where, I mean, each of us, we have a stake in the church and we have this responsibility. And that's part of due process as well. And so, I mean, I think we've just forgotten all those things, and they all tie together to require us to do justly.
And even the big scandal right now in the Southern Baptist Church, I mean, it's a difference in degree, but it's not a difference in kind than what the Roman Catholics did with all the pedophilia, where they hid it for years. Because they, and there's a lot of churches in the Southern Baptist Convention that have hid molestation by their pastors, rape by their pastors. And I don't even, we can talk about all the issues with what the SBC should do about it. But what we can say is there's a lot of churches that do this. And if you do that, you're really not different than the Roman Catholic Church, which means you've really rejected the sovereignty of God, and you should be scared.
And when you talk about the issues of how they're handling it, it's due process issues. It is. You didn't handle it on the one hand rightly, and now you've got an opportunity to bungle it again.
Right. Where you're intentionally setting it up for bias, you're intentionally setting it up for not examining witnesses. I mean, it's
something that has to be dealt with. We're not saying no. It has to be dealt with, but due process.
Right. And in the end, I mean, from reading what the SBC has decided, I just don't see how they won't get a lawsuit in a few years. Like cost them millions.
I'm already getting Facebook ads saying, have you been abused in a Southern Baptist church? Sign up for the lawsuit.
Right, because there's going to be huge lawsuits.
And the SBC basically collected a combination of gossip, hearsay, and actual evidence and just compiled it into a big thing. You know what I mean? It's like it's not even horrible. No justice anywhere in any of it.
Right, no examination of witnesses, huge partiality. That the ones that they like, they're going to examine, and they go, no, we don't believe it. But the other ones that they don't really know, the people they'll put in there, I mean, it's opening to all these things we listed. And again, if the church doesn't get this right, the state's not going to. The society's not going to. If you've made it to the end of this episode about due process, it's not exactly the most engaging of subjects, but it is one of those subjects that is crucially important, that is causing so much damage to our country and so much damage to the church. And the church really needs to repent and not just think it can do whatever it wants. This is the duty of man, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before God. We need to be about the business, about the work of doing justly. And a lot of that comes to following due process. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.